he heard a faint cry coming from beneath a massive rock deep in the national park. No one would ever believe that a rock could cry, but when the ranger broke it open, everyone froze. No one was prepared to see what was hidden underground. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? The first light of dawn crept slowly over the jagged mountain ridge, casting pale streaks of gold across the towering pines of Silver Ridge National Park. The air was crisp, still holding the deep chill of night, and every breath seemed to crystallize before dissolving into the morning calm. Malik Johnson pulled the zipper of his jacket up to his chin and inhaled deeply, letting the scent of damp earth and evergreen needles ground him in a place where he always felt more himself than anywhere else. He stood outside the ranger station for a moment, watching as the mist clung to the forest floor like a veil, reluctant to rise. The world here was different than the one he had been born into. Here, nobody judged him by the color of his skin, his past, or the part of town he came from. Here, the forest treated everyone equally. Malik had come a long way from his childhood in the heart of the city, where the closest thing to nature was the scraggly tree that grew stubbornly through a crack in the concrete outside his apartment building. Growing up, he had learned early that survival meant staying alert, reading people, knowing when to speak and when to disappear. He saw neighbors scared of the very police meant to protect them. He learned that sometimes the system failed people like him, and if you wanted justice, you had to reach for it yourself. Those lessons had shaped him, had given him an unshakable resolve. He would be someone who did not look away when others needed help. It still surprised him sometimes that he had become a park ranger. Many of his teachers would have never guessed the quiet boy in the back of the classroom, the one who rarely smiled and vanished into the background, would someday spend his days among mountains and trees instead of streetlights and traffic. But something inside him changed the first time he stepped into a state park as a teenager during an outreach program. For the first time in his life, he felt small and safe. The wind whispering through branches sounded like freedom. That moment planted a seed that would grow stronger with time, guiding him away from concrete alleyways and toward open trails. Now, years later, he was one of the few black rangers patrolling thousands of wild acres. He took pride in it. Patrols, rescues, firefighting when necessary, whatever the job demanded, he did it. But more than anything else, he protected this place. He believed the forest had a voice of its own, subtle and wise, and if you listened carefully enough, it would tell you everything you needed to know. His boots pressed into the dewy dirt path as he began his morning patrol. A thermos of coffee warmed one of his hands, while his other rested near the handheld radio clipped to his vest. The trees towered above him like silent guardians as he followed the narrow winding trail deeper into the woods. The morning was perfectly ordinary, calm in the way only early hours could be, when the world hadn't yet decided what to be. Birds flitted above, a squirrel darted across his path, and a distant woodpecker tapped out a rhythmic greeting. Malik checked trail markers, made notes about minor maintenance tasks, and nodded quietly to the peace around him. He had walked this trail countless times. It rarely saw visitors, mostly because tourists preferred the well-photographed parts of the park instead of these remote, shadowed paths near the mountainside. Still, he enjoyed the quiet. It gave him time to think without the constant hum of the station radio or the chatter of hikers asking directions. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first. The woodpecker's tapping faded. The bird calls diminished one by one until there was nothing left but the soft crunch of his boots on soil. Even the wind seemed to pause as though the forest had taken a long breath and forgotten to release it. Moloch slowed his pace, brows tightening. A still forest was never a good sign. Predators sometimes caused animals to silence themselves, but there was no rustling of underbrush, no snapping of branches, no signs of a large animal nearby. He stopped completely. The world around him was motionless, suspended. He frowned, turning his head slightly to listen harder. Something in the air felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, but his instincts prickled like static beneath his skin. His heartbeat echoed too loudly in his own ears. He waited for a sign, any sound that would break the eerie tension cloaking the trees. Then it came. So faint that at first he thought he imagined it, a soft, wavering whimper. His mind tried to rationalize what he heard: the wind, an animal caught in brush, the branch of a tree rubbing against another. No, none of those possibilities matched the fragile desperation in that sound. It was unmistakably a cry, small, muffled, almost lost in the ground itself. Moloch froze. A child? Out here? He held his breath, head tilted to pinpoint the direction. As he took a slow step forward, the sound came again, barely audible, a fragile thread of sorrow woven into the silence. His heart clenched. There was no logical reason for an infant to be in the depths of this park, but logic didn't matter. Someone, or something, needed him. He marked his location on his GPS with shaking fingers. The urgency in that tiny cry pulled him forward as he stepped off the established trail and into thick underbrush. The brambles clawed at his uniform, low branches tugged at his jacket, but he pushed through. The cry wavered and faltered, growing even weaker. A spike of panic shot through him. He moved faster. As he climbed a slight incline, the forest opened into a quiet clearing. The morning sun filtered through the trees in thin beams, illuminating spots of moss that glowed an almost unnatural green. And there, in the center of the clearing, lay a massive boulder. It looked ancient, like a fallen fragment of the mountain itself, rough, domed, and covered in dark moss and tangled roots. It seemed oddly out of place, as though someone or something had dragged it there. Moloch stepped closer, heart hammering against his ribs. The instant he approached, the tiny cry sounded again, from below the rock. His breath caught, beneath it. The sound came from beneath the ground. He crouched, running his hand over the edges of the boulder. The moss was torn in places, soil around the base darker and looser than it should have been. Someone had disturbed this earth recently, dug into it, buried something under it. And that something was still alive. He pressed his palm against the cool stone, feeling dread ripple through him. This wasn't a hiker accident. This wasn't a lost animal. Someone had intentionally hidden a living being under a rock that weighed more than a car. The realization hit him in a crushing wave of disbelief and horror. He tried shifting the rock with his shoulder first. The mass didn't budge. He planted his boots, gripped the rough surface with both hands, and pushed until his muscles trembled, but it might as well have been a part of the earth itself. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cold air. He glanced toward his truck, a distant outline through the trees far behind him. He would need tools, real tools. But then the cry came again, so faint it was almost silence. No, he whispered to himself under his breath, though no words truly formed. It was pure instinct, refusal. He couldn't let that voice fade away. He couldn't leave someone helpless a second longer than necessary. He stepped back, eyes scanning the ground, and spotted a thick fallen branch, strong, sturdy enough to serve as a makeshift lever. He shoved one end beneath the edge of the boulder and leaned his body weight against the other. The branch bent, strained, and snapped under the load, leaving Malik gasping in frustration. He knew then that no amount of pushing would free whatever was underneath. His hand rose to his radio, but he knew backup would be slow. He was deep in the woods. Communication was unreliable. Help could take far too long. The cry had nearly vanished already, and he felt the seconds slipping from him like sand through his fingers. The only way this being, this child, would survive was if he acted now. Malik's mind snapped to his truck again. In the back of it, stored for clearing fallen branches or breaking ice when necessary, was a heavy iron pry bar. It was a gamble. Running all the way back and returning would cost precious minutes. But it was the only chance. The Ranger sprinted with a speed he had not tapped since high school track meets. Brush scraped his legs, small stones rolled beneath his feet, but he didn't falter. His lungs burned, not from the effort, but from fear. Fear that the forest would fall silent again for a different reason. Fear that when he returned, the voice would be gone. All he could hear as he ran were those weak, fading cries echoing through his memory. By the time he reached the truck, he was panting heavily, breath coming in sharp bursts as he yanked open the cargo compartment and seized the pry bar. The solid metal felt reassuringly heavy in his hands. He didn't wait to catch his breath before turning back, heart surging with every pounding step. When he reached the clearing again, he fell to his knees beside the stone, muscles trembling as he wedged the metal beneath its base. He drove the tool deeper into the dirt, gritted his teeth, and heaved with all his might. The boulder shifted, just a fraction, but enough to confirm it wasn't immovable. But it was too slow, too small a change. He lifted the pry bar and struck the boulder near a thin crack running across its surface. The impact sent a shudder up his arms. He struck again, and again. The thud of metal on rock echoed like a heartbeat through the stillness. His breath ragged, sweat dripping down his brow, he continued until hairline fractures spread across the stone like veins of lightning. He swung with renewed vigor, a desperate rhythm fueled by pure refusal to give up. A final strike rang out sharply, then silence, followed by a groaning creak as part of the boulder split away and collapsed beside him in a shower of dust and moss. The cry came again, faint but undeniable. Malik dropped the bar and clawed at the loosened earth with his bare hands. Dirt packed beneath his fingernails as he tore through the soft soil. His heart felt too big for his chest, pounding with terror and hope tangled together. Each inch he cleared made the sound more real, more urgent. Finally, his fingers brushed against something soft. Fabric. He dug faster, revealing a filthy, water-soaked bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. His hands shook as he pulled it free, soil falling away from the edges. The fabric twitched, just the slightest movement, and his breath caught painfully in his throat. He peeled it open carefully. Mud smeared across his gloves as he lifted the corner of the cloth. What he saw rooted him to the spot, knees nearly buckling. A baby, a newborn child, trembling weakly, face pale beneath a mask of dirt. Tiny lips quivered faintly, releasing another fragile sound. Malik's chest tightened so hard he could barely breathe. Someone had buried this child alive beneath a rock. Someone had decided this tiny human did not deserve to live. His hands shook with fury and fear as he cradled the bundle against his chest, feeling the fragile warmth it still held. The baby's breaths, thin, unsteady, were like shreds of hope struggling not to vanish. Malik swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. He had found the cries before they stopped. He couldn't lose them now. The forest remained silent. but not the haunting silence from before. This silence now felt like reverence, like the woods themselves waited, watching, holding their breath as Moloch fought for the smallest life he had ever held. He wrapped the child in his jacket, shielding the frail body from the cold morning air. One hand pressed gently against the infant's back, urging each tiny breath onward, while his other scrambled for the radio. His voice came out uneven, thick with adrenaline as he called for immediate medical response. The signal crackled, broke, returned. Voices answered, directions exchanged. Help was coming. But minutes, even seconds, could mean everything. Moloch lowered himself to sit, back pressed to the broken edge of the massive stone. The infant whimpered against his chest, a fragile flame in a world that had tried to snuff it out. Moloch rocked slightly, instinctively, though he barely realized he was doing it. He focused on keeping the tiny child warm, alive here. As the growing light of morning stretched across the forest floor, Moloch glanced again at the rocks, the torn soil, the remnants of the burial. This wasn't an accident. This was a secret someone wanted erased. And if he had arrived just a little later, that secret would have stayed buried forever. But he was here. He had heard. He had listened when silence warned him something was wrong. The first distant wail of a siren drifted through the trees, breaking the tense stillness. Relief washed over him as fierce as the panic that had driven him moments earlier. Help was arriving. The child had a chance. Moloch looked down at the tiny human cradled in his arms. The baby's breaths, though still weak, came with just a little more strength now. He felt something swell inside him, something heavy and powerful and terrifying, responsibility. He didn't know who had done this or why, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This forest had called him here, and he had answered. What he uncovered beneath that ancient stone would change his life forever. The ambulance lights flickered through the trees like restless ghosts as they wound their way back down the narrow service path. Moloch stood alone now, long after the paramedics and officers had left the clearing. The weight of the moment lingered on his shoulders like a wet cloak, heavy, cold, and unshakable. The child had been taken to the hospital, where real professionals could keep her alive, but Moloch's heart still raced violently in his chest, as if it hadn't yet accepted that he no longer needed to fight for each of the infant's fragile breaths. He stared down at the crumbled stone fragments around his boots, the pieces of the once mighty boulder scattered as if it had been broken by something far more powerful than steel or strength. Its destruction stood as evidence of desperation and instinct. He had refused to walk away, and because of that stubbornness, a life had been pulled back from the edge of death. The morning sun climbed higher, burning the last streaks of fog away and illuminating the clearing more clearly than before. The moss that once blanketed the boulder's curved surface now lay ripped, shredded, and smeared with dirt. Moloch crouched and pressed his palm into the disturbed earth, letting it sift loosely through his fingers. The soil was too soft, too recently turned. Someone had dug here not hours ago, but within the last day, maybe even just last night. The baby had not been underground long enough to suffocate, but long enough that every second mattered. He closed his eyes, imagining what must have happened here. A pair of hands, trembling irresolute, shoveling dirt in the quiet darkness. Hastily placing the child beneath the boulder's shelter, not caring whether she lived or died. Someone had come here with purpose, calculated, planned, because burying a baby beneath a rock so heavy it would take specialized tools to break was not an act of panic. It was a sentence. A burial with no marker and no chance of discovery. unless fate interfered, or unless a ranger happened to walk by at just the right moment and listen to the silence long enough to hear what hid beneath it. Malik opened his eyes and stood, brushing the soil from his hands with a rough swipe. His legs still trembled with adrenaline, and the muscles in his arms ached fiercely from the brutal effort of breaking that stone. It didn't matter. The only thing he cared about now was understanding what had happened. Hospitals would handle the baby's immediate survival, but he knew that where there was a victim, there was a perpetrator. This wasn't a lost child. This was a crime. He retrieved the pry bar he had thrown aside and inspected the broken stone again. This time, not in frantic urgency, but with the trained eye of a ranger who had investigated dozens of illegal camps, wildlife killings, and disappearances. The broken edge of the boulder revealed lighter, fresh rock beneath the matted green surface. That lighter shade told him the stone had split completely today, by his own blows, yet the scratches along its edges were older, thinner, deliberate. Somebody had tried to move it, and when they failed, they had decided to bury their secret beneath it instead. There were grooves where tools had slipped, where a lever had strained and failed. Whoever did this had been determined. He stepped away, scanning the ground around the clearing. The soft dirt held footprints, at least 2 different sizes. One larger, possibly a man's. One smaller, the steps shallower but equally fresh. The spacing suggested haste, a rush to finish before someone returned. He knelt again, pulling his camera from his belt and snapping photo after photo, documenting every imprint, every detail. The sun was rising fast. If he didn't preserve these signs now, a single gust of wind or wandering deer could erase them forever. While he worked, his radio crackled to life. The dispatcher checked in about the infant, relaying that the hospital staff was able to stabilize her condition for now. They didn't know her name yet. Not even her first cry had been recorded by the world. But she was alive. Malik exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief making his knees weaken for a moment. Then the dispatcher mentioned one more thing. Officers would return later to conduct a more formal investigation of the scene. Malik was to secure the area until then, ensuring nothing was disturbed. When the radio clicked silent again, Malik returned to studying the boulder, his brow furrowed in thought. The plan had been so specific. Why choose this clearing, so deep into the park, far beyond the normal hiking routes? He paced slowly around the stone, trying to see the location through a criminal's eyes. Maybe they knew this place. Someone familiar with the park would choose ground where rangers rarely patrolled at night. Someone local, someone calculating. Someone who thought the forest could hide their sins forever. But something had gone wrong. The baby had been left alive, concealed but breathing. Whoever did this must have believed the earth itself would do their deadly work. Malik's fists clenched. They underestimated the child's will to survive, and they underestimated him. He circled around the boulder again, then paused at a particular spot where the ground was more disturbed than anywhere else. Kneeling, he uncovered the indentation that appeared deeper than the rest. A shovel had been driven into the dirt here again and again, slamming into the earth with urgency. There were flecks of white near the surface, almost too small to notice. He picked one between his fingers. Bits of shattered limestone. That meant the boulder hadn't always been there. It had likely been rolled or dragged into place after the hole was dug. The thought turned his stomach. He took a step back and assessed the clearing from afar. Branches overhead leaned inward, as if the forest itself was curling protectively around the space. He imagined how still the night must have been when the perpetrators executed their plan. How the trees might have watched silently as the ground swallowed a newborn. The realization that someone chose this place not to abandon, but to bury, sent a chill deeper into Malik's bones than any winter draft could manage. He photographed the area again, then knelt once more, his hand resting where the hole had been. The dirt remained slightly warm from the infant's presence, or perhaps it was only his imagination, the warmth of life that refused to be extinguished. He wondered if the baby had made any noise while they buried her. He wondered whether the hands that covered her in dirt hesitated even once. He hoped they did, because that would mean at least a shred of humanity had been left behind in the darkness. But the harsh truth whispered back that they probably hadn't hesitated at all. Hours passed. The sun moved higher. Malik remained where he was, documenting everything, thinking, rethinking, walking the clearing in increasingly wide circles. He didn't want to stop. If his mind paused, then the heavier thoughts, the emotional weight of what could have happened here, might crush him. He forced himself to stay analytical. He followed faint tracks where the bark of a nearby tree had been scraped recently, perhaps by a vehicle passing too close. A few broken branches indicated someone dragging something heavy or trying to conceal their path. The clearing was secluded, but not inaccessible. A small ATV could make it this far. Someone could arrive unseen after dark and leave without leaving a trace. Almost without leaving a trace. Almost. He photographed those markings, too. Only when a different howl cut through the silence did Malik lift his head. Not a siren this time, but the distant call of a wolf echoing through the pines. The normal sounds of the forest were returning gradually, cautiously, as though the woods had been holding a vigil and only now released their breath. Nature had paused to allow one fragile life the space to be saved. Malik stood and let his gaze rest on the broken pieces of the boulder. Its presence had once symbolized immovable weight, an eternal monument that no one questioned. But now, shattered, it had become something else entirely. It was proof that a determined human being could break through what others believed solid and unbreakable. It was proof that fate didn't always fold as villains intended. He thought of the baby again. He had never held a child so small, so fragile. His heart twisted when he imagined that tiny chest rising and falling, the infant clinging to life with the barest thread of strength. That little girl was a fighter, just like the rock had been. The difference was the rock had cracked and fallen, while she held on. Malik moved closer to the edge of the clearing and surveyed the terrain leading away from it. Tracks disappeared into thicker brush. There might be more clues further down the slope, traces of footprints in softer mud, more signs of forced passage. But caution whispered that going too far now risked damaging evidence before the investigators arrived. He would have to hold back, though his instinct screamed to follow the trail right then and there. His radio buzzed again, a brief message confirming officers were on their way, but the distant hum of an approaching engine already reached his ears through the trees. Soon, he would not be alone with the clearing and its secrets. He remained there, motionless, until the first patrol vehicle pulled up to the service road and two officers stepped out to join him. They greeted him with professional nods, their expressions shifting from curiosity to grim understanding as they scanned the site. Malik shared what he had observed, pointed out the footprints, the disturbed earth, the marks on the boulder. One officer whistled low under his breath when he realized just how heavy the stone must have been before it split. Malik simply nodded. There was nothing impressive about his strength, nothing heroic. He had simply been desperate, and that desperation had turned into force. The officers asked questions, and he answered them, the memories flooding out in broken fragments of fear, adrenaline, and determination. They began setting up markers and cordoning off the area, preparing for a full forensic sweep. Malik remained close, unwilling to step away despite the ache coursing through his arms and back. His duty wasn't finished. Maybe it wouldn't be finished for a long time. When the lead investigator finally told him he could return to the station and complete paperwork, Malik hesitated. His feet did not want to leave the dirt that had nearly become a grave. He looked once more at the broken boulder, the place where a child's cries had risen from beneath the earth. That moment had split something inside him as surely as the pry bar had split the stone. This wasn't just another incident on his daily patrol. Something deeply wrong had happened here. Someone intended for that baby to vanish, erased from existence. They believed the world would never know she had been born. They believed her cries would never be heard. But he had heard them. As he began the long walk back to his vehicle, a new silence settled over the forest. It wasn't the unnatural stillness from earlier, heavy with dread and hidden suffering. This silence carried a different weight, a promise. The forest seemed to murmur beneath the breeze, watching him, acknowledging what had happened. Malik felt its gaze like an ancient presence. This was not the end. Not for the baby, not for whoever buried her, and not for him. He placed a steadying hand on the radio at his chest, as if to ground himself, and allowed a new thought to bloom, one that carried both responsibility and fire. He would find out who had done this. He would follow every track, overturn every stone, challenge every lie. That child deserved justice, and he would not stop until her story had its truth. That vow echoed between the trees long after he stepped out of the clearing, swallowed by the shadows of the towering pines. By the time Malik reached the ranger station, the adrenaline that had fueled him all morning had begun to fade, leaving a deep exhaustion that settled into every limb. His shirt clung to his skin with dried sweat. Dust marked the knees of his uniform, and his fingers still bore crescents of dirt beneath the nails. Yet none of that mattered, not compared to the image that replayed again and again behind his eyes. The tiny, dirt-covered infant, gasping against his chest, fighting to stay in a world that had tried to bury her alive. Inside the station, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to the gravity of what he had just lived through. Papers shuffled, phones rang, radios crackled with minor concerns. Lost hikers, suspicious campfires, a missing dog, and every bit of it felt absurdly normal. How could everything be so mundane when something monstrous had happened just beyond the tree line? Malik moved stiffly toward his desk, ignoring curious glances from colleagues who had heard only fragments of what he'd done. He sank into his chair, letting out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The dispatcher handed him the initial incident forms. He stared down at the blank spaces, his pen hovering. How could he translate the horror of that moment into words that fit neatly in designated boxes? Infant found beneath large boulder. It looked clinical, detached, nothing like the nightmare he'd unearthed. But protocol required objectivity, so he forced himself to write, though every sentence felt like a betrayal of the panic and urgency that had consumed him earlier. He noted the time he first heard the cry. He detailed his attempts to move the rock. He described breaking the boulder and uncovering the cloth bundle. When he reached the line requesting condition of found person, he hesitated. His throat tightened as he remembered the baby's skin. Cold, too cold, and the way each breath sounded like a fragile plea. He wrote, critical but alive, wishing he could put something more human there, like the truth that she was a miracle. Captain Reyes entered the room, his expression carved from granite. He was a seasoned officer who had seen more than most, and yet even he seemed shaken as he reviewed the preliminary report. His gaze lifted to Malik, studying the tension in his shoulders and the rawness in his eyes. Without speaking, Reyes pulled up a chair and sat opposite him, leaning forward slightly. "Doctors say she's stable," Reyes said after a moment. The simple sentence landed like a warm blanket over Malik's frayed nerves. Stable. She had made it through the first terrible hour. That alone felt like a victory. They're still running tests. She's dehydrated, underweight, but they think she'll pull through. Reyes rubbed his brow, sighing. Finding her when you did, it's the only reason she's alive. Malik nodded, though he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had stumbled into a tragedy by chance. But deep inside, he also felt certainty. He had been meant to hear her. Reyes continued. We're treating this as attempted homicide. Someone intended for that baby to die out there. Somebody who didn't care if her last moments were spent alone in the dark. His voice hardened to a low growl. We'll find who did this. They won't get far. Malik didn't respond right away. The weight of responsibility hadn't lifted. It had only shifted. Amos, one of the younger rangers, approached with hesitant concern. You okay, man? They said you broke a rock in half with a pry bar. There was awe in his voice, tinged with disbelief. Malik offered a weary shrug. I just did what needed to be done. He didn't add that he would have torn apart a mountain if that's what it took. When the necessary administrative work was finally done, Malik left the station to wash the dirt and sweat from his skin. But even under the stream of hot water, he couldn't wash away the fear that the baby's tiny breaths had sparked in him. How close she had been to silence forever. How close he had come to arriving too late. His mind kept circling back to the quiet clearing, to the boulder, to the footprints. Someone had carried the child into those woods. Someone had dug that hole. Someone had walked away without looking back. After changing into a clean uniform, Malik found himself unable to sit still. The clock's ticking seemed louder than usual, each motion of the second hand a taunt reminding him there was no time to waste. He drove back toward the hospital, not because duty required it, but because his heart dragged him there. The hospital's sterile corridors smelled of antiseptic and fear. Malik checked in with the nurse who directed him to a small examination room. He paused outside the door, steadying his breath before pushing it open. Inside, beneath soft, warming lights, lay the baby. Cleaned now, wrapped snugly in a fresh blanket instead of a dirty scrap of cloth. Her cheeks, still pale, carried faint swirls of pink returning to them. Electrodes monitored her heartbeat, and a nurse gently checked her vitals. Malik approached slowly, afraid to disturb the fragile calm that now enveloped her. Her eyelids fluttered, and her tiny body shifted slightly under the blanket, but she did not cry. She seemed exhausted, as if she had already fought a lifetime's worth of battles. Malik stood over her, unable to look away. You're a fighter, he whispered inside his mind, not daring to speak aloud. You weren't supposed to be found, but you cried anyway. You made the world hear you. He studied the blanket tucked around her, the stark contrast to the freezing earth she'd been hidden beneath. The nurse noted aloud that she had very little clothing when found, just remnants of fabric that appeared cut or torn hastily. It struck Malik anew that the person responsible hadn't chosen to leave her by a doorstep or a fire station or any place where she might be saved. They chose a grave. A doctor entered quietly and greeted Malik, recognizing him as the rescuer. The gratitude in the doctor's tone made Malik shift uncomfortably. He didn't want thanks. He wanted answers. "Has anyone come forward?" he asked. The doctor's expression darkened. "No, and that worries us. A parent who leaves a child out of desperation usually regrets it quickly. They reach out, but in this case..." He paused. This was meant to be permanent. Malik felt his jaw clench. He looked once more at the infant's face, memorizing the shape of her nose, the fragile curve of her fingers. Whoever she belonged to had forfeited the right to call themselves family. She wasn't discarded. She was targeted. He stepped back, one last look anchoring itself in his heart before he exited the room. He promised silently that he would return, that she wouldn't face this world alone. Later, back in his truck, he remained parked far longer than necessary, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what to do with the storm inside him. Rage simmered, thick and choking, but also there was something gentler, a protective pull he couldn't ignore. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she'd been condemned, but he already cared more than he understood. He returned to the station and reviewed the photographs he had taken. Multiple sets of footprints, a dragged mark, disturbed brush. He traced every detail, committing it all to memory. The investigation team would process the scene, yes, but this was personal now. He wouldn't merely file a report and move on. As evening drew near, Officer Halford stopped by Malik's desk. "Forensics found tire impressions," he said quietly. "Maybe an ATV. Could give us a make and model once casts are done. Progress, a thread to pull." Malik nodded, already thinking ahead. The nearest access point for any vehicle that size was several miles away. He could start there, ask around. Someone must have seen something. Night had begun to settle outside the station windows, shadows stretching long across the floor. He should have gone home, should have rested. Instead, he gathered his keys again. Before he left, Reyes caught his arm. "We'll handle this, Johnson. You did your part." Malik shook his head slowly. "My part isn't finished yet." Reyes studied him for a long moment, then released him with a resigned nod. "Be careful. You're too close to this." "Someone should be close to it," Malik replied before walking out. The woods greeted him with the same towering silence as before, but now he understood it differently. It was not emptiness, it was memory. The trees remembered what had been done under their branches. The earth still held the imprint of a terrible decision, and Malik would not let the forest forget. He retraced the route vehicles might have taken, kneeling to examine the ruts that cut into the dirt. One set matched the fresh impressions found earlier. He followed them into the undergrowth, mentally marking each bend and turn. He pushed through vines and stepped carefully over patches of disturbed soil. Every sign he found fed his determination. The moon was rising by the time he reached the steep incline where the tracks faded. It was dark now, and instinct urged caution, but his resolve outweighed his fear. This was no longer just a crime scene. This was a promise. Someone had tried to erase a life, and Malik had intervened. That intervention wasn't just a moment. It was a commitment. He finally turned back toward home, knowing he would return again at first light. Tonight, he needed to put his thoughts on paper, line up every detail, consider every possibility. His mind churned with questions. Who was that baby? Who wanted her gone? And how far would they go to make sure no one knew she existed? At his apartment, he moved through the rooms mechanically, barely noticing anything around him. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands, still raw in places where rock had bitten skin. He tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes he heard that cry again, thin and desperate, calling to him from beneath the ground. It was the sound of a life refusing to end. Malik turned onto his side, eyes open, heart awake, mind locked onto the same truth that had guided him through the forest. Someone buried a baby and believed she would never be found. They were wrong, and Malik would prove just how wrong they were. Morning arrived without mercy. Malik had barely slept, his thoughts running in restless circles until the first hint of daylight crept through his blinds. When he finally rose, his body protested each movement, muscles stiff from the previous day's brutal effort, but his mind was already racing ahead. There was no room for rest, not when a newborn had been left to die beneath a mountain of stone. Not when someone responsible for that act still walked free beneath these same skies. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to drown the exhaustion, and headed out before the sun had fully claimed the sky. The drive to the station seemed shorter than usual, the road unwinding beneath his tires like a path he had already memorized in his bones. As soon as he stepped inside, he was greeted by a stack of new reports and updates. Forensics had sent initial findings from the clearing, traces of synthetic fibers in the soil, perhaps from a blanket or clothing, impressions matching boot soles with a unique tread pattern, fragments of a cheap, mass-produced shovel blade that had snapped under pressure, and, as he hoped, tire castings, likely from a mid-sized ATV, the kind sold at only a few local stores. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Officer Halford appeared at his desk, holding a sealed evidence bag. Inside it were 2 strips of fabric, dirty, frayed, but unmistakably patterned. A small flower print, faded almost beyond recognition. It turned Malik's stomach. That fabric had once wrapped a human life, a feeble shield against cold earth and crushing stone. It belonged to someone, a mother, perhaps, who either abandoned her child or someone from whom the child was taken. Someone used this to wrap her up, Halford muttered, voice subdued. We'll analyze it for DNA. Maybe we'll get a match. Malik nodded. His eyes lingered on the soft pink outline of a blossom barely visible through the dirt. A detail like that didn't belong in a grave. It belonged in a crib. A mother, making an impossible choice, might have left the baby somewhere she'd be found. That fabric felt like love. The burial felt like hate. Those two truths could not coexist without someone's heart having been broken, or severed entirely. Throughout the morning, officers filed through to take their turns at the scene, photographing, measuring, marking every inch of disturbed earth. Malik joined them for a few hours, helping secure the area, and offering insights only someone who found the child could provide. He pointed to the direction from which he believed the perpetrators had approached. He explained how the silence of the forest had first alerted him to something wrong. Every detail mattered. It wasn't long before rumors began to circulate, hushed whispers in corners of the station. A baby buried alive. No missing child reported. No distraught parents calling hospitals. A crime so cruel it didn't seem real. And yet, the evidence lay stark and undeniable in evidence bags back at the lab. Malik heard snippets of speculation, voices strained with fear or disgust. What kind of monster does that? Maybe someone from those compounds out near the ridge. You know what people say about them. Heard there's trouble with meth labs again. Could be gang-related. That family on the edge of town, the Hardens, they've always been odd. Malik listened but didn't engage in gossip. He held on to facts. He reviewed maps and routes, thinking through every hidden access point in the forest. If someone wanted secrecy, they would use the old maintenance paths, the ones not posted on tourist maps. Only locals knew them. Only hunters and loggers used them, and only someone determined to make a child vanish would choose the most remote one. Later that day, he returned to the hospital. He told himself he was only checking on the baby's condition, updating his own notes. But when he reached her room, he realized he needed to see her. She lay peacefully beneath a warming lamp, heartbeat monitored steadily, small fingers curled softly near her cheeks. Malik felt something loosen inside him when he saw her breathing without struggle. She looked less like a fragile creature clinging to life and more like a survivor, a testament to impossible resilience. A nurse approached quietly. "She hasn't cried since we stabilized her," she whispered. "She seems calm, exhausted, but safe now." Safe. Malik tasted the word, but couldn't fully believe it. Safety was not granted by a hospital bed. Safety came only when threats were removed. And the threat that buried her was still out there. He studied the baby's features, looking for clues. She had caramel-toned skin, darker at the knuckles and cheeks. Soft, black wisps of hair curled against her scalp. The possibilities narrowed in his mind. A child like her in a nearly all-white rural region would be noticeable. Someone would know. But there were fewer residents of color near the valley. Families kept to themselves. Communities were tight, but outsiders, including people of Malik's complexion, were still scrutinized more than welcomed, which meant if she was born nearby, the mother might have faced judgment, fear, pressure, or worse. As he drove back through town, he made a detour. The grocery store, a gas station, a diner. He asked casually if anyone had seen a pregnant woman recently, someone who perhaps suddenly wasn't anymore. Most shrugged. A few offered possibilities, vague and unsure. One elderly cashier pursed her lips before offering a name, the same that Malik had overheard at the station. "The Harden girl," she muttered. "Brittany. She disappeared from school a few months ago. Folks said she was sent away to live with an aunt, but others said she was in trouble. Hardens don't like anyone poking their nose around their business." The warning in her voice was unmissable. The Hardens lived near the woods, near the ridge, near access roads used by hunters, a lead, finally, a path with direction. Before following it, he returned briefly to the station to inform Captain Reyes. Reyes frowned deeply. "We can't jump to conclusions because of rumors," he warned. "We investigate based on facts. We get a warrant before stepping foot on someone's property. We do this right." Malik understood. He nodded, but patience felt like a burden, and every second waiting was a second the guilty got farther away. That night, he couldn't calm the churn inside his head. The threat had grown teeth. Someone had acted with intention and without regret. His instincts whispered that whoever buried that child might already know she survived. They might know it was Malik who had saved her. Every moment after that discovery, he felt watched, not by the forest, but by human eyes lurking somewhere beyond the tree line. As he patrolled the quiet woods that evening, darkness settling heavy around him, Malik saw shadows he couldn't explain. In the corner of his vision, a figure moved quickly between trunks. When he turned, there was nothing. He paused, heart thudding, scanning the brush. Branches shifted slightly, though there was no wind. He stepped forward, flashlight cutting a beam through the black. A fresh footprint sank into the mud. Not his. Not a hiker's tread. Rural boots, deep grooves, recent. Someone had been following him. His breath caught, not from fear, but from confirmation. He wasn't imagining this. He wasn't alone. When he returned home hours later, he found his mailbox open and a single scrap of paper inside. No signature. Just a message scrawled in rough, almost gouged lettering. Keep quiet or you'll join her. His pulse slowed to a cold, furious calm. Someone thought fear would silence him. Someone believed he would walk away. They didn't understand who Malik had become. They didn't understand what kind of fire had ignited inside him the moment he heard that baby's first broken cry. He folded the note carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he stepped outside again, eyes narrowing thoughtfully toward the darkness. He would not be intimidated. He would not retreat. That child had survived a grave. He would ensure she survived everything that followed. The investigation that opened with a whisper beneath a stone was now roaring like thunder in his mind. Questions tangled into knots that he was determined to unravel. Why was she buried alive? Who wanted her gone so desperately? And what kind of truth was so dangerous that someone had to silence even a newborn? Malik stared out into the night, jaw set, fists clenched. This forest had called him once. Now he was listening for its answers. Night lingered in the sky longer than usual, as though the darkness itself was reluctant to release its grip on the world. Malik felt it too, the weight of something unseen pressing at the edges of his senses, a tension that refused to loosen even as the first fragile hints of dawn crept across the treetops. He barely recalled falling asleep, and the moment he opened his eyes, he wondered whether he had slept at all. Memories of the threatening note flickered like a restless flame in the back of his mind. Keep quiet, or you'll join her. The words had carved themselves into him, not as fear, but as confirmation. The danger was real. The enemy was real. Whoever was behind the attempted burial knew that the baby still lived. And worst of all, someone had been close enough to him to leave that message without ever being seen. He dressed quickly, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. He moved with new purpose, guided not just by duty, but by a promise he had made silently beside that hospital bed. The child had survived one attempt on her life. He would not allow a second. At the station, even the usual morning chatter felt tainted by unease. Officers spoke in hushed tones now when they thought he couldn't hear, and glances tracked him as he passed. But nobody asked him to stand down again, not directly. It was as if Reyes had warned them that pushing Malik now would only make him dig deeper, and they were right. Malik wasn't on the sidelines of this case. He was stitched into its very center. He spent the early hours combing through files and mapping the park's lesser-known access points. Every unmarked trail, every forgotten service road, he plotted them all with precision. His eyes kept drifting back to one location, the old logging route that snaked dangerously close to the Hardin property. Years ago, that family had petitioned to control part of the land for private use. The request had been denied. Local rumor claimed they continued to use it anyway, believing they owned whatever the forest didn't fight them for. It made sense. Too much sense. Reyes entered the office as Malik studied the map. The captain's expression was guarded. He lowered himself into the chair beside Malik without a word. For a moment, silence hung tense between them. "You got something?" Reyes finally asked, though the grit in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Malik tapped the map. A vehicle could have entered from this trail. No cameras, no rangers patrol here at night. ATV tracks were recent. Reyes exhaled slowly. The Hardens. Possibly, Malik said, but we need to confirm quietly. We've made some inquiries, Reyes admitted, leaning back. Brittany Harden wasn't sent to an aunt. She dropped out mid-term. School said she was pregnant. Family denied it. No medical records showing a birth anywhere. A cold shiver shot through Malik's spine. So, either she miscarried, Reyes continued, or she had that baby and didn't want anyone to know. Or, Malik said, voice low and sharp, someone in that family didn't want her to keep the child. His throat tightened around the idea. A girl, isolated, forced into silence, stripped of choice, until someone took what was hers and tried to bury it alive. He felt the anger flare again in his chest, hot, unrelenting. We're working on getting a warrant, Reyes said, but the judge needs stronger evidence before we step foot on Hardin land. Malik knew how this worked. Laws protected the innocent, but sometimes they shielded the guilty for too long. Later, Malik rode out toward the logging trail. He needed to see it with his own eyes. The drive was rough, stones bumping under the tires, branches scraping along the sides of the truck. He parked when the road narrowed too tightly for the vehicle to continue and continued on foot, senses sharp, every breath measured. The forest here was different. Wilder, untouched by tourists. The canopy thickened overhead, swallowing the daylight in greedy gulps. The smell of damp pine was stronger, tinged with something metallic, like rust or old blood clinging to the air. Malik stepped over a fallen log and saw it. Fresh ATV treads pressed deep into the soft earth. They led away from the trail, weaving through trees toward a slope that dropped down into a shallow ravine. He crouched, fingertips grazing the tracks. Recent. As in last night, recent. Someone had returned. A snap of a twig echoed nearby. Malik spun, hand instinctively moving toward his holstered weapon. But he saw nothing except shadows dancing between trunks. He rose slowly, eyes narrowed, pulse steady yet alert. He scanned the woods, searching for unnatural stillness. The silence now was different than before. Not foreboding. Watching. Show yourself, he thought, though he said nothing aloud. Whoever was there was skilled. No rookie criminal could tail a trained ranger undetected. This was someone who knew the forest, someone who belonged to it, someone who believed they had the right to bury secrets beneath it. He followed the tracks downward, deeper into the ravine. The further he went, the more signs of human movement appeared. Broken branches, mud displaced violently, scuffed soil where someone had fallen or kneeled, then a scrap of fabric caught on a briar. Malik lifted it carefully, the same flower pattern as the cloth from the grave. His stomach twisted. A faint trail of boot prints veered off sharply to the right. Malik followed them until he reached a clearing he had never seen on any map. In the center stood a rusted shed, leaning sideways as if it were trying to escape its own foundation. The door hung loosely, one hinge broken. Malik approached quietly, adrenaline creeping along his spine. The structure smelled of oil, old wood, and something fouler beneath it. Fear, maybe, or despair. He pushed the door with the tip of his boot. It creaked open in a slow complaint, sunlight slicing across the floor. Inside, tools were scattered in disarray. Shovels caked with dirt, rope coils, a gas can. Against one wall, a stack of cinder blocks. Against another, a metal chain. Every item here told a story Malik did not want to imagine. But what seized his attention was the small piece of cloth lying alone in the dirt. He knelt beside it. A baby's clothing, torn, stained. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. A sound rustled behind him, light, quick. Malik spun, stepping out from the shed in a defensive stance. He searched the tree line, but again saw nothing. Whoever was out there was toying with him, testing him, measuring the threat he posed. Back in town, as evening settled over Silver Ridge, Malik returned to the hospital once more. The baby, though still tiny and fragile, looked stronger than she had the day before. Her chest rose with steadier breaths. Her little fingers curled with new strength. Against the glow of soft lights, she appeared to be thriving, a defiant statement that life refused to dim. Malik stayed only a moment, afraid that his presence might disrupt the fragile peace around her. But as he turned to leave, a doctor caught up with him. "We found something," she said. She held a printed lab report. Her blood type. It's rare, AB negative, less than 1% of the population. Another narrow thread, another clue tightening the noose around the truth. As Malik drove home, the first stars began piercing the dusk. Yet, the same sensation from the ravine followed him, a prickle in awareness, a presence lingering just beyond sight. When he pulled into his driveway, he sat motionless in the cab of the truck, watching his quiet street. A porch light flickered on 3 houses down. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Everything looked ordinary, but he knew ordinary was an illusion. He stepped out of the truck and moved toward his door, hand resting cautiously near his sidearm. His boot brushed something. He looked down. A dead bird lay at his feet. Its neck snapped. A message, a warning. Another one. Malik's breath grew slow, deliberate. He scanned the houses, the rooftops, the dark spaces between street lamps. Someone had been here, close enough to leave this at his threshold. His home, supposedly his refuge, had been breached by fear. But fear was a weapon he refused to let them wield. He crouched slowly, staring at the lifeless bird as though it might whisper a clue. Its tiny chest was still warm. Whoever did this had left minutes ago. He stood, heart hammering with a new mix of fury and clarity. They were escalating. The walls around this crime were trembling. The truth was pushing its way out of the ground, just as that baby had pushed her first cries through soil. Malik understood now that this wasn't only about a child. It was about power, the kind that hid in the shadows of small towns, unchallenged for generations. The kind of power that convinced itself it could bury anything, or anyone. Inside his house, Malik locked the door, drew every curtain shut, and sat at his dining table with the evidence he carried in his memory. A newborn with no name. A vanished girl. Boot prints and ATV tracks leading to a property known for trouble. A message meant to scare him away. Everything pointed toward one truth. He was getting close. Too close. Even so, Malik could not step back. Each threat only hardened his resolve more. The darkness stalking him would not get the last word. The forest had chosen him to hear a cry that the world almost missed. He would honor that call until every secret hidden beneath that heavy stone was dragged into the light. He turned the deadbolt once more. 3 locks now stood between him and the night outside. But safety wasn't a door that could be locked. It was a battle. And Malik was just beginning to fight. The threats continued. Every morning brought some new sign that those who had buried the newborn were watching him closely, waiting for him to make a mistake. A shattered lantern left in the middle of his porch. deep scratches on the side of his truck that looked disturbingly like claw marks, but far too deliberate to be made by an animal. The headlights of an unknown car flashing in his window at 2 a.m. before disappearing into the night. Fear didn't creep into Malik's life. Fear stormed in with boots on, trying to shake him. But beneath all of that intimidation, fury now burned where fear once tried to grow. Malik had seen something in that child's tiny struggle for life that reminded him of his own past. He refused to let darkness continue its silent rule. Yet, despite everything, the most difficult part of the following days wasn't the stalking shadows or the threats. It was the waiting. Waiting for the warrant. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for the next step. The law was slow. Justice, slower. But evil moved quickly. Malik spent every hour he wasn't patrolling sitting in briefing rooms or going over evidence, analyzing the tire tracks, comparing boots, reviewing soil samples, and following up leads the police dragged their feet on. What he discovered made the picture clearer and more horrific. Brittany Hardin had not been seen in nearly a month. The Hardins' neighbors whispered quietly that they had heard shouting at night. The lights in their house flicked on at strange hours, and someone saw what looked like a young girl's silhouette through an upstairs window, hands pressed to the glass as if she was reaching for help that never came. Malik's chest tightened each time someone mentioned her name. Brittany was barely more than a child herself. He pictured her young hands shaking as someone dragged her into that forest, as her newborn was taken, as a shovel carved out the earth that would become the baby's tomb. He imagined her sobbing into silent darkness while bigger hands decided what would happen to her child. He imagined her begging, and someone ignoring it. That was the moment Malik's resolve turned into something sharper, unyielding steel. The judge finally signed the warrant on a gray afternoon when rain spit angrily against the station windows. It authorized an official search of the Hardin property for any evidence related to a newborn child. The room buzzed with preparations the moment the document arrived. Officers checked weapons, reviewed assignments, and discussed safety protocols. The Hardins, as Reyes warned them, were not the sort to go quietly. Malik was not invited to be part of the entry team, but Reyes approached him just before they mobilized. There was a long silence, tension stretching like tightrope wire between them. "I know you want to be there," Reyes said, voice low, "and I'm not saying you can't come, but I need you focused, Johnson. I need you calm. If this goes sideways, if guns come out, if someone gets hurt, we can't afford mistakes. Not today." Malik nodded slowly. He understood, but inside he felt like the storm had finally broken and nothing could restrain the wind. They drove in convoy, 3 marked patrol vehicles followed by 2 unmarked SUVs. Rain sheeted across the road like translucent curtains, blurring the world into streaks of gray and green. Trees loomed taller and darker as they neared the Hardin property, their branches swaying in violent agreement with the weather. When they arrived at the entrance, 2 iron gates rusted by neglect, everything went silent. Even the rain seemed to muffle itself. Malik stepped out of his vehicle, boots sinking into wet ground. Ahead, the Hardin house stood like a rotting monument, peeling paint, boarded windows, roof sagging from years of weather and rage. A porch swing hung crookedly from a single chain, creaking in the relentless wind. Reyes raised a fist, signaling the final approach. "Sheriff's office," the lead officer called out as they neared the door. "We have a warrant to search the premises." Tension bristled in the air like static before a lightning strike. No answer came from inside. The officers exchanged glances, and the battering ram was called forward. In 2 powerful hits, the door splintered inward with a flash of splinters and a howl of hinges. They entered fast, clearing corners, weapons drawn. Moloch followed behind Reyes, heart thundering. The smell that washed over them was decay, mildew, stale smoke, and something darker, something that made Moloch's throat clench. Inside, the house looked ransacked, but not by police. Furniture overturned, cabinets hanging half open, walls with holes punched through them, as if someone had searched frantically for something or destroyed evidence in a desperate rush. In the kitchen, plates shattered on the floor, food left out to rot. A moldy baby bottle sat on the counter. Moloch stared at it until his vision blurred. In the living room, a fireplace held a pile of burned papers, birth records, notes, pictures, so much gone forever in ash. Upstairs, officers found a room that had once belonged to a teenager, clothes scattered, a mattress with ripped sheets, broken picture frames on the ground, glass reflecting Moloch's flashlight as he stepped over them. He picked up one photograph, its center cracked across a smiling girl with brown hair pulled into a ponytail. Brittany. But her eyes, even in the photo, held fear. "Clear!" officers called from each room, but none of what they found cleared anything in Moloch's mind. If anything, it made everything worse. The house held no family, no father, no mother, no Brittany. They were gone. Reyes called it in. His voice collected but strained. Moloch heard only fragments. Possible flight. Bolo issued. Private roads. Hunting cabin? Moloch's gaze lifted sharply. A cabin. He thought of the ATV tracks, the shed, the ravine. A cold certainty washed over him. They didn't leave the forest, he murmured. Reyes turned just as Moloch was already heading out the door. Without another word, the captain signaled the officers. They moved fast, back to the vehicles, back into the storm, racing toward the dense woods where shadows had swallowed secrets for too long. As they skidded to a stop at the start of the old logging trail, Moloch leapt out first. The rain made the ground slick, but the tracks he'd seen before were made deeper now, fresh, desperate. The Hardens were running. They plunged into the forest, flashlights cutting through sheets of rain. Moloch led them down the ravine, following the same path as days before. Voices crackled over radios. Officers split into tactical formation. The world felt reduced to pounding footsteps, breaking branches, and Moloch's pulse roaring like thunder in his ears. Then, lights. Faint beams flickering between trees. The officers surrounded the clearing. The cabin crouched there, dark wood glistening with rain. Smoke curled from its chimney. Recent. Alive. Reyes signaled silently. Officers tightened grips on guns. "Sheriff's office," he bellowed. "Anyone inside, come out with your hands where we can see them." A pause. A breath held by every tree. Then the door slammed open. A man burst out holding a shotgun. Time fractured into sharp pieces. He fired wildly, one blast striking a tree trunk inches from Moloch's head. Officers returned fire. A scream tore the air. The shotgun clattered to the mud. The man, Eldon Harden, the patriarch, fell and lay motionless, rain pooling red around him. Moloch did not stop. He ran past the fallen body into the cabin. Inside, Brittany stood trembling near a table, pale and soaked with tears, her arms bound. Her eyes were wide and wild, but when she saw Moloch, horror mixed with desperate relief. Before he could reach her, a figure lurched from behind her. Mrs. Harden, clutching a kitchen knife, voice breaking into a guttural cry. Rage warped her features as she hurled herself toward Moloch, blade flashing. Reyes tackled her before Moloch even realized she'd moved. The knife slid across the floor. Mrs. Hardin screamed words that dissolved into grief and madness. She ruined everything. That devil baby wasn't welcome. We were saving her soul. Malik rushed to Brittany, cutting the restraints from her wrists. "You're safe," he said, breath unsteady. "It's over." But she shook her head. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered one hoarse word that chilled Malik's blood. "No." Her gaze darted to a back corner, a locked storage chest. Reyes ordered an officer to open it. With 2 strikes of a crowbar, the lock snapped. Inside, wrapped in thin blankets, lay another infant. Smaller. Still. Too still. Brittany collapsed against Malik with a wail that tore through the cabin like the scream of a wounded animal. Malik lifted the second child into his arms, searching for any sign of life. A stir, a breath. Weak, but present. Malik looked to Brittany, and in her face he saw every heartbreak the world had forced upon her. This was not just cruelty. This was terror disguised as righteousness. Madness fed by control and silence. She had lost so much already, and nearly lost everything. Medics rushed in. Officers secured the scene. The storm outside raged harder as if the sky itself finally allowed its grief to fall. Hours passed. The Hardins were taken into custody, one bleeding and silent, the other screaming until her voice died. Brittany and both babies were transported to safety, guarded like treasure. Malik stood outside the hospital as dawn finally broke, the clouds parting just enough for light to spill over the world. He closed his eyes and let the warmth touch his face. He thought of the first child, the one whose tiny cries had risen from beneath the earth. She was recovering well, doctors now optimistic. She would live. He thought of the second child, rescued moments before becoming another secret in the dark. Alive, because someone finally listened. And he thought of Brittany, just a girl, but stronger than the hate that had tried to crush her. She would need years to heal, but she had survived. She too had chosen to live. Reyes approached quietly, resting a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You did it," he said. "No," Malik answered softly. "They did." "The babies?" Malik shook his head and looked toward the horizon where mist still clung to the edges of dawn. "The forest," he said. "It refused to keep their secrets any longer." For the first time in days, Malik breathed without feeling the weight of the world pressing against his ribs. The storm had passed. The sun rose stronger, shimmering through the leaves overhead. He knew dark things would always try to hide beneath the ground, buried under stone and silence. But as long as someone listened, truly listened, the forest would speak, and he would always be there to hear it. Here in the breaking light of a new morning, hope was not just possible, it was alive. Before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe, because stories like this are only the beginning. What happens next will shock you even more. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And check out the next story right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.